I was a cleaning lady working 3 jobs to survive when I took a position at a billionaire's mansion. One evening, while dusting his private study, I found a framed photograph tucked in a drawer. A young man that was probably the owner of the house. The problem? Laughing with his arms around his shoulders was another young man, my father. And sitting on my father's shoulders was a little girl. Me, at maybe 3 years old. I had to know why he had this photo. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where are you watching this from? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you love stories about hidden legacies, second chances, and the complicated nature of redemption, please subscribe so you don't miss our next one. Now, let me take you back to the evening that changed my understanding of everything. My name is Pamela Jones, and at 28 years old, I was living paycheck to paycheck in San Francisco, one of the most expensive cities in America and filled with more billionaires per capita than almost anywhere else in the world. The irony wasn't lost on me. I could barely afford my studio apartment in the Tenderloin, while people a few miles away in Pacific Heights lived in mansions worth more than I'd earn in 10 lifetimes. I worked 3 jobs. Mornings, I was a barista at a coffee shop near the financial district. Afternoons, I cleaned offices in a downtown high-rise. And 3 evenings a week, I worked for Prestige Home Services, a cleaning company that serviced the homes of San Francisco's ultra-wealthy. The money from all 3 jobs barely covered rent, utilities, food, and the crushing medical debt I'd inherited when my father died 5 years ago. Victor Rodriguez had worked construction most of his life, then as a janitor in his final years when the cancer made physical labor impossible. He'd fought for 2 years, and the treatments had drained every penny he had and then some. When he died, he left me with $127,000 in medical bills and a studio apartment full of his belongings that I couldn't bear to sort through. I had been paying $500 a month toward that debt for 5 years. At this rate, I'd be 40 before it was paid off. The Caldwell estate was one of my newest assignments. Richard Caldwell was a tech billionaire, one of those men whose faces you'd recognize from magazine covers, even if you couldn't quite remember what company he'd founded. Something to do with software and artificial intelligence. The kind of wealth that was almost incomprehensible to someone like me. His house in Pacific Heights was more like a compound, 3 stories, probably 12,000 square feet, with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge that was worth millions all by itself. I'd been cleaning there for 3 months, always in the evening after Mr. Caldwell had left for the day or was traveling, which was most of the time. In 3 months, I'd seen him exactly twice. Once when I was leaving as he was arriving, and once when he'd walked through the kitchen while I was cleaning it. Both times, he'd been on his phone, barely glancing at me, offering a distracted nod that might have been acknowledgement or might have been coincidence. I didn't take it personally. To people like Richard Caldwell, people like me were functionally invisible. We cleaned their houses, made their coffee, delivered their food, and existed in a parallel universe that rarely intersected with theirs. The estate manager, an efficient woman named Mrs. Mary Voigt, had given me very clear instructions on my first day. Mr. Caldwell values his privacy. Clean thoroughly, but quickly. Don't touch anything on his desk in the study. Don't move any papers. Don't open any drawers unless you're putting away laundry. And absolutely do not disturb him if he's home. I'd followed those rules religiously for 3 months. I was a good cleaner. Thorough, fast, invisible. I needed this job. At $35 an hour, it was the best paying of my 3 positions, and I couldn't afford to lose it. On the evening that changed everything, I arrived at the Caldwell estate at 6 p.m. as usual. Mrs. Voigt had left a note. Mr. Caldwell traveling until Friday. Deep clean the study, please. It's been neglected. The study was on the 2nd floor. A massive room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk that looked like it cost more than my car, and walls covered with framed patents, awards, and photographs documenting Richard Caldwell's rise from startup founder to tech titan. I'd cleaned this room dozens of times, but always quickly, always careful not to disturb anything important. Tonight, with permission to deep clean, I could be more thorough. I started with the bookshelves, dusting each shelf, pulling out books to clean behind them. Then I moved to the walls, carefully cleaning each framed item. That's when I started noticing something odd. Several of the documents on the wall listed two names, Richard Caldwell and Victor Rodriguez. Rodriguez, my father's last name, but that was a common name, especially in California, probably just a coincidence. I kept cleaning, moving to the massive mahogany desk. Mrs. Void had said not to touch papers on the desk, but deep cleaning meant I could clean the drawers, organize the desk accessories, dust underneath everything. I opened the top right drawer to dust inside it, and that's when I saw the photograph. It was in a silver frame, lying face up in the drawer as if someone had been looking at it recently. The photo showed two young men, probably in their mid-20s, standing in front of what looked like a small office or warehouse. They had their arms around each other's shoulders, both grinning at the camera with the kind of unself-conscious joy that speaks of deep friendship. One of the men was clearly a young Richard Caldwell. I recognized him from the other photos around the house, though he looked so much younger. His hair still dark, his face not yet marked by the weight of wealth and responsibility. The other man was my father. I knew my father's face like I knew my own. I'd spent the last 5 years looking at the few photographs I had of him, wishing I had more, wishing I'd taken more pictures when he was alive, instead of being too busy, too distracted, too convinced we'd have more time. But this wasn't one of the photos I had. This was new, and impossibly, sitting on my father's shoulders in the photo, grinning with 3-year-old delight, was me. I sat down heavily in Richard Caldwell's expensive desk chair, still holding the framed photograph, my hands shaking. I looked again at the framed documents on the wall. Victor Rodriguez. This made no sense. My father had worked construction. He'd been a laborer, an honest working man who'd never made more than $50,000 a year in his life. He'd never mentioned knowing anyone wealthy, never mentioned working in tech, never mentioned anyone named Richard Caldwell. And yet here was undeniable proof my father and Richard Caldwell, clearly close friends, with me as a toddler in what looked like the early days of some kind of business venture. I carefully set the photo down and looked around the study with new eyes. The patents on the wall, I walked over and read them more carefully now. System and method for distributed computing architecture. Inventors, Richard Caldwell and Victor Rodriguez. Filed March 1998. Adaptive learning algorithm for neural networks. Inventors, Richard Caldwell and Victor Rodriguez. Filed August 1998. There were 5 patents total, all filed between 1997 and 1999, all listing both names. My father had been an inventor, a tech entrepreneur, a co-creator of the innovations that had made Richard Caldwell a billionaire. And he'd died broke working as a janitor, drowning in medical debt. I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. What had happened? Why was my father's name on patents that were clearly worth billions, and why had he ended up with nothing? I kept searching the study, no longer caring about the rules about not touching things. In the bookshelf, I found a photo album tucked between technical manuals. Inside were more photos. My father and Richard Caldwell in their 20s, clearly building something together. Photos of a small office with a hand-painted sign, Caldwell and Rodriguez Technologies, 1998. Caldwell and Rodriguez. My father had been a partner, a co-founder, not an employee, not a friend, a partner. I took out my phone and started taking pictures of everything, the patents, the photographs, the album. I needed evidence. I needed proof. At the bottom of the album, I found a newspaper clipping from 2000. Tech startup Caldwell Technologies goes public. Founder Richard Caldwell now worth $500 million. Just Caldwell, not Caldwell and Rodriguez. My father's name was gone. I sat at the desk for a long time, my mind racing. Finally, I pulled out my phone and called my aunt, my father's sister, Rosa, the only family I had left. Tia Rosa, I need to ask you something about Dad. Did he ever work in tech? Did he ever know anyone named Richard Caldwell? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mija, why are you asking about that? Because I'm cleaning Richard Caldwell's house right now, and I found photos of him with Dad, patents with Dad's name on them. Tia, what happened? Why didn't anyone tell me? Rosa sighed, and when she spoke, her voice was heavy with old pain. Your father made me promise never to talk about it. He said it was in the past. But if you found proof, Mija, your father and Richard Caldwell built a company together. They were best friends. And then Richard betrayed him in the worst way possible. The story Rosa told me that night, pieced together from fragments my father had shared over the years, was devastating. In 1995, my father, who'd been a brilliant, self-taught engineer, had met Richard Caldwell at a tech meetup in San Francisco. They'd bonded immediately over shared ideas about computing and artificial intelligence. Both were young, ambitious, and broke, and they decided to build something together. For 3 years, they worked 18-hour days in a tiny rented office, living on ramen and dreams. They filed patents together. They built prototypes. They created genuinely innovative technology in distributed computing and neural networks. By 1999, they had something valuable. Several major tech companies were interested in acquiring their technology. They were about to go public. They were going to be rich, set for life. And then Richard's family got involved. Richard came from money, not tech money, but old San Francisco money. His family had lawyers, advisors, people who understood business in ways that my father, the son of immigrants, never had. Those lawyers convinced Richard that my father was a liability. He didn't have an MBA, he wasn't polished, he spoke English with an accent, he didn't look like the face of a tech company that wanted to court Wall Street investors. In May 1999, Richard's lawyers approached my father with a buyout offer. $50,000 for his 50% stake in the company, all patents and all future proceeds. My father, who had a pregnant wife with expensive medical complications, who was terrified of losing everything, who trusted his best friend, signed the papers. The company went public in November 1999. The IPO valued it at $800 million. Richard Caldwell became a multi-millionaire overnight. My father got $50,000, money that was gone within a year, spent on my mother's medical care, before she died giving birth to my stillborn sister. Your father never forgave himself, Rosa told me, her voice breaking. Not for signing the papers, but for trusting someone so completely. He said he should have known better. He should have protected you. He spent the rest of his life working whatever jobs he could find, and he never spoke about those years. He was so ashamed. I felt tears streaming down my face. Why didn't he fight? Why didn't he sue? He tried me, huh? He contacted lawyers, but the contract was ironclad. He'd signed away everything. The lawyers said he had no case. And even if he did, he couldn't afford the legal fees to fight someone as wealthy as Richard Caldwell. After I hung up with Rosa, I sat in Richard Caldwell's study, surrounded by the evidence of his wealth. Wealth that should have been half my father's, and felt a rage so pure and hot that it made my hands shake. My father had died broke. I'd held his hand in a county hospital room, watching him waste away because we couldn't afford better care. I'd worked 3 jobs for 5 years trying to pay off his medical debt. I'd given up college, given up dreams, given up any chance at the kind of life my father had wanted for me. And all along, the man who'd betrayed him had been living in a mansion, building an empire on the foundation of my father's stolen work. I took the framed photograph from the drawer and walked out of the study. I didn't care about the job anymore. I didn't care about the rules. I needed answers, and I needed them from Richard Caldwell himself. I left the mansion, but I didn't quit. I came back 2 days later on a Friday evening and waited. Mrs. Voigt had mentioned that Mr. Caldwell was returning from his trip today. I positioned myself in the kitchen, ostensibly cleaning, but really just waiting for him to come home. He arrived at 8 p.m., walking through the door with his phone pressed to his ear, already deep in some business conversation. He barely glanced at me as he walked toward the study. I followed him. "Mr. Caldwell?" He turned, surprised. "Yes, is something wrong?" I held up the photograph. "I need you to tell me about this." His face went white. The phone slipped from his hand, clattering on the hardwood floor. He stared at the photograph, then at me, and I watched as recognition slowly dawned. "Oh my God. Pamela. You know who I am? I've been looking for you for 3 years. You're Victor's daughter. You've been working in my house? Answer my question. Tell me about this photograph. Tell me about my father. Tell me why your name is on a billion-dollar company and my father died broke." Richard sat down heavily on the stairs, his face buried in his hands. When he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. "Your father was my best friend, the best friend I ever had, and I betrayed him. I've lived with that guilt every single day for 25 years. That's not an answer. I want the truth, all of it." And so Richard Caldwell, billionaire, told me everything. He confirmed Rosa's story, but with additional devastating details. The lawyers had pressured him for weeks. His own father had threatened to cut him off financially if he didn't protect the family's investment by removing the immigrant liability. Richard had resisted at first, but eventually, ground down by pressure and convinced that it was just business, he agreed. "I told myself I'd make it right later," Richard said, his voice hollow. "I told myself that once the company was successful, once the money started coming in, I'd find Victor and give him his fair share. But by then, he'd disappeared, changed his phone number, moved away. I hired investigators. It took me 15 years to find him. And I sent lawyers with a settlement offer. $50 million, what his stake would have been worth, adjusted fairly. He refused it." I stared at him. He refused $50 million? He sent a 1-page letter back. I've kept it all these years. Richard stood up and walked to his study, returning with a weathered piece of paper. He handed it to me. The handwriting was my father's. I recognized it from birthday cards and grocery lists. "Richard, I don't want your money. Money can't undo what you did. You valued profit over friendship, and that's a choice you have to live with. But I have one request. If anything happens to me, find my daughter. Her name is Pamela. She's a good kid, smarter than both of us. She deserves better than what we both gave her. Take care of her. Not with money, with opportunity. Give her the chances I couldn't give her. That's the only thing you can do for me now. Victor." I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. When did he send this? 2 years before he died. "I've been looking for you ever since I learned about his passing, Pamela. But you'd changed your name, using your mother's surname instead of Rodriguez. You'd moved several times. You weren't on social media. You were invisible. I was surviving. I was working 3 jobs to pay off the medical debt that killed my father, the debt he wouldn't have had if you'd given him what he deserved 25 years ago. I know." Richard's voice was barely a whisper. "Pamela, I know nothing I say can undo what I did, but I've been setting money aside in a trust for you since the day I received your father's letter. It's been accumulating for 5 years. The trust currently holds $200 million. The number was so large, it was almost meaningless. You think you can buy forgiveness? No, I know I can't. This isn't about my forgiveness. It's about honoring your father. He built that company as much as I did. More, actually. He was the brilliant one. I was just the one with the connections and the polished presentation. The money should have always been his, and now it's yours. I don't want it." The words came out before I'd fully thought them through, but as soon as I said them, I knew they were true. My father refused your money because he had integrity, because he understood that some things can't be bought. I'm not going to dishonor his memory by accepting what he rejected. Richard looked at me with something like respect. "You're just like him." He said almost exactly those words. He paused. "But Pamela, your father also said to give you opportunities. He didn't want money for you. He wanted you to have the life he couldn't give you. Taking this money doesn't mean forgiving me. It means accepting what's rightfully yours, what should have been your father's." I stood there in the hallway of this mansion, this monument to wealth built on my father's stolen work, and felt torn between rage and practicality, between honor and survival. "If I take this money," I said slowly, "it's not for you. It's not forgiveness. It's not absolution. You still betrayed my father. You still let him die broke. That doesn't change." "I know." But my father's final message was about giving me opportunities. So I'll take the money. But I'm going to use it in a way that honors him. Not to buy things or live in a mansion, to build something that matters. Richard nodded. "What will you do?" "I don't know. I may start a foundation, something to help immigrant entrepreneurs. I'm going to fund people like my father, brilliant engineers and inventors who don't have connections or polish or access to capital. I'm going to make sure they don't get erased from the companies they build. I'm going to make sure my father's name means something." For the first time, Richard smiled. A real smile, not the practiced one from magazine covers. He would love that. He really would. "There's one more thing," I said. "I want my father's name restored to the company history. Every patent, every press release, every piece of documentation. Caldwell Technologies was built by Caldwell and Rodriguez. I want the world to know that." "Done. I'll have my lawyers draft the paperwork immediately." 6 months later, I stood in a bright, modern office space in downtown San Francisco, with a sign over the door, "The Victor Rodriguez Foundation." The walls were covered with photographs, including the one I'd found in Richard Caldwell's drawer, now professionally restored and enlarged. My father, young and hopeful, building something with his best friend. Me on his shoulders, grinning with toddler joy, unaware of the heartbreak that would follow. The foundation had already funded 15 startups, all founded by immigrant entrepreneurs who'd been told they weren't investable, who didn't have the right connections or the right look or the right background. We provided seed funding, mentorship, and legal support to ensure they maintained ownership of their innovations. Richard Caldwell had been true to his word. My father's name was now prominently featured in Caldwell Technologies' official history. The company website dedicated an entire page to co-founder Victor Rodriguez, acknowledging his contributions and the injustice of his erasure. It didn't change what had happened. It didn't bring my father back, but it was something. Richard had asked to serve on the foundation's board. I'd said no. "This isn't about you." I told him, "This is about making sure what happened to my father never happens to anyone else." He had accepted that without argument. I still worked. Not 3 jobs anymore, but I worked. I served as executive director of the foundation, making sure every dollar was spent honoring my father's memory. The remaining money from the trust, the parts I didn't need for the foundation, went into scholarships for first-generation college students studying engineering. One evening, about a year after that confrontation in Richard's hallway, I received a call from him. In it, he told me that he'd been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He had, at most, a year to live. He wasn't telling me to gain sympathy or to ask for anything. He just wanted me to know that he was leaving his entire fortune, everything beyond what was already in my trust, to the Victor Rodriguez Foundation. I built an empire on your father's stolen work. The least I can do is ensure that empire is used to prevent others from being stolen from the way I stole from him. I can't undo what I did, but I can make sure that the company we built together, and yes, it was together, even though I tried to erase him, creates a legacy that would make Victor proud. I'm sorry, Pamela, for everything. Your father deserved better. You deserved better. I hope the foundation helps, in some small way, to make things right. After the session, several founders approached Richard to thank him. One of them, a young Pakistani engineer named Fahad, asked if Richard would mentor him personally. I'd be honored. Over the following months, I saw Richard transform. Or maybe I just saw him more clearly. He was patient with the entrepreneurs, generous with his knowledge, brutally honest about his own failures. He celebrated their victories like they were their own, and mourned their setbacks with genuine empathy. One afternoon, I found him in the conference room with Fahad, going over a term sheet from a venture capital firm. This clause here, Richard was saying, pointing to a paragraph, this is how they'll slowly dilute your ownership. By the time you realize what's happening, you'll own less than 20% of the company you built. Don't accept this. But they're offering $10 million, Fahad said. That's life-changing money. Yes, and it's also a trap. Hold out for better terms, or find different investors. Your technology is worth far more than they're offering, and they know it. That's why they're trying to lock you in now before you realize your value. Fahad listened, took notes, asked questions. Richard answered each one with the patience of someone who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. When Fahad left, Richard saw me standing in the doorway. How long have you been there? Long enough. You're good at this. He smiled, tired but genuine. Your father would have been good at this too. Better than me, actually. He always saw people's potential. I only learned to see their market value. You're learning now. Too late, unfortunately. For me, anyway. But maybe not too late for them. He gestured toward the door where Fahad had exited. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Richard said quietly, "Can I tell you something?" Okay. These past few months, working here, mentoring these brilliant people your father would have loved, it's the first time in 25 years that I haven't felt crushing guilt every waking moment. Not because the guilt is gone, it's not, but because I'm finally doing something that feels like honoring Victor instead of just mourning what I destroyed. I sat down across from him. He would have liked this, I think. My father. He would have liked seeing these people get real chances. He would have. He was always more interested in building things than in being recognized for building them. That's why he was so easy to erase from history. He didn't fight for credit the way I did. Richard's eyes filled with tears. Pamela, I know you can't forgive me. I don't expect you to, but I want you to know that your father was the best person I ever knew. And I'm sorry, I'm so deeply sorry that I let fear and greed destroy the most important friendship of my life. I reached across the table and took his hand. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement, connection. I said, he loved you too. You know that. Even after everything, my aunt told me that. He said you'd been corrupted by people who didn't understand what really mattered, but that somewhere inside was still the friend he'd believed in. Richard's composure cracked completely. He wept, deep, shaking sobs of grief and regret, and perhaps finally the beginning of something like peace. Richard Caldwell died on a Tuesday morning in March, surrounded not by family, he had none close by, but by 5 entrepreneurs from the foundation who'd insisted on being there. Fahad, who had successfully negotiated a fair term sheet thanks to Richard's mentorship, Maria, who'd launched her app the month before, and Chang, whose AI algorithm was already being used by hospitals. They told him thank you. They told him his mentorship had changed their lives. They told him that Victor Rodriguez would be proud of what he'd helped build. Tell Pamela, Richard whispered. his voice barely audible, that I hope I did enough. Not for forgiveness, just enough to honor him. You did, I told him, stepping into the room. I'd rushed over when I got the call. You did enough, Richard. You can rest now. He smiled, squeezed my hand weakly, and closed his eyes. He died 20 minutes later, peacefully, holding the hand of the daughter of the man he'd betrayed, surrounded by the people whose lives he'd helped change in his final months. At Richard's memorial service, I spoke. Not about his billions, or his company, or his achievements, about redemption. Richard Caldwell spent 25 years living with the guilt of betraying his best friend. He could have died with that guilt, letting it define his legacy. Instead, he spent his final months trying to ensure no one else would suffer what my father suffered. He mentored entrepreneurs, shared his mistakes, and used his knowledge to protect the brilliant people society often overlooks. He couldn't undo his past, but he could shape the future. And he did. My father believed in second chances. He believed people could be better than their worst moments. Richard Caldwell spent his life proving my father wrong about him. But in his final months, he finally proved my father right. The foundation continued to grow. Richard's fortune, combined with what he'd already set aside, allowed us to expand dramatically. Within 2 years, we'd funded over 200 companies. Within 5 years, we'd become one of the most respected incubators for immigrant entrepreneurs in the country. I still have that photograph on my desk, but now, next to it, there's another photo. Richard in our conference room, surrounded by entrepreneurs, mid-laugh during one of his mentoring sessions. His face is thin from illness, but his expression is genuinely happy. My father taught me about brilliance, hard work, and dignity. Richard, in his belated way, taught me about grace, redemption, and the courage it takes to face your failures honestly. Both lessons were worth learning. Both men deserved to be remembered, not for their perfect moments, but for their real ones. What did you think of Richard's journey toward redemption, and Pamela's choice to give him a chance to make amends? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story about hidden legacies, second chances, and the complexity of forgiveness touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more meaningful stories every day. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss our next thought-provoking tale. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.